We have 3 clusters, starting with mindfulness and embodied pathway to social justice. The Jazz Ensemble, a training model for building social creativity in the workplace, and recognizing the importance of all through intentional programming of music for all. So really excited. Oh, ends at 150. Thank you, Missy. Oh, I'm adding time. My apologies. So let's get started, and the rest of our friends will join as they come back. Do we have any specific comments or any other comments about how our multiple identities affect our daily lives? I really appreciate, Dr. Lisa, your presentation, and not to put our presenters back on a spotlight, but I just had a quick prompt. Do we have any comments about the presentation, how it affected you, how it showed up in your body and your thought process? Now is the time to share.
I was curious. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Trae.
Oh, I was just going to say, I appreciated, we do a little bit of kind of, I'm definitely going to use more of what you did today, but we do a lot of that with the students in our ensembles at the beginning of each semester, just sort of asking the question about, all right, let's just sort of self-identify ourselves here. We don't do it out loud. I just have them write it down, and so they can sort of recognize, like, where do I meet this group? What do I identify about myself? What are my experiences? And how those might be different than others. And sometimes students volunteer to share that as well, but I really appreciated doing that. I don't know that I've ever done that with like professionals. It's like, it's nice to be in a room full of like-minded folks, and oftentimes we have these conversations that are difficult and challenging, but to say, okay, let's get back to the roots of this. And I think you mentioned it as well, and maybe Hetty mentioned it earlier too, I find myself at the table often working on committee work related to IDEA, and so it's nice to be in a room where everyone says, let's go back to the roots of this and ask all these foundational questions that really set us out on this idea for change. So that's great.
Thank you. Thank you. Hetty, did you have something you want to say?
Yes, I was curious because I do these questions with younger adults and and professionals, and I feel once we actually start talking, it is after so much time. And I was wondering for you, what has your challenges been in your own identity that you have noticed in kind of navigating and moderating these sessions?
Well, there's always the concern, that when, to be really blunt, when you're a white woman born into privilege, although born into poor privilege, so I didn't recognize the kind of privileges maybe others did, and but over time, when I became more aware, the burden of knowing that you're born into privilege just because of the color of your skin is heavy to say, I didn't ask for it, and I have these benefits, and now I'm going to talk to people about it. And when people of color arrive, how will they see me as authentic, really wanting to be present and to share the gifts that I have and the knowledge so that we can create a community of healing? There's always a risk that someone would not view my identity, that I believe that I'm an advocate for social change, that I can't be legitimate because I don't look like what you would expect. And although, despite having those anxieties and insecurities, that has not been my experience. When we start with the kinds of practices, it allows us to deepen and build trust and to come into a community of caring, that if I think I didn't start that way, I would encounter those problems. At Bausch and Lomb, I was the affinity leader for all of our different groups, which included African American, and gay and lesbian. That's what they call them, the gay law or gay alliance, and our Hispanic group, and then also administrative assistants, which will make you laugh at that time, like why would they need their own group? But we had it, and to show up as a legitimate voice and representative of the company when I am white, presents its own challenges. I still remember, I'll share this with you. I went to an event for the National Black Association for MBAs, huge conference, 20,000 people. And at one point, my colleague, who identifies as African American, says to me, Lisa, what does it feel like? And I said, well, Cassandra, what do you mean? She goes, what does it feel like when you look around and there's no one, and this is honest, nobody was white, nobody looked like me. And we're on this huge escalator that's bringing about 2,000 people down. I've never seen like 4 escalators going at once. And she says, how does that feel? And I said, well, I didn't notice it at first because we were talking, but when I really sat with it, it was the first time I was surrounded by people that didn't look like me. And I looked around, I smiled, and people smiled back. And I said, well, right now, I feel comfortable and safe. I said, but I've never experienced this before. And she turns to me, she goes, this is how I feel every single day at work, at the grocery store. And then tears started coming down my face. And I started to realize there was work that I needed to do to understand other people's experiences. So I know it's a long answer to your very brief question, but you know, I got to show up authentically me and hope that I can make a difference.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for your comment. And it also makes me think of the presentation Professor Rolle just presented, when we think about this idea of dealing with change, right? And mistakes. I put a question in the chat, like, how has your experience, not just Lisa, but how has your experience been with dealing with change and mistakes in corporate sectors or educational sectors, right? Thinking about Professor Rolle's presentation, right? This idea of building social creativity in the workplace. Anyone, please feel free to answer. Or chime in. Professor Rolle, that's for you too. We can't hear you. You're on mute. Yeah, you're on mute. You have to click off or click on. Oh, we still can't hear you.
Try something, say something right now.
No. Now, I think I hear something. Is that you? No. Nope, we can't hear you.
Unfortunately, we can't. No.
No.
Okay.
Oh, there we go. Now we hear you.
Okay.
Hey.
And I put on the headphones and hopefully so that I could get better sound.
Mhm.
And then hey, that's technology. I got to improvise with the change. But to more or less piggyback on what you just were stating, you know, it's so important to move towards change by recognizing there's value in other contributions. And that's one of the things that is so, you know, we have come from, and I'm talking about the whole culture, not specifically a ethnic culture, but the whole culture of being protective of oneself and being fearful of what will happen when you start to contribute. You know, so we are at a very dynamic stage historically, where ideas can actually be pushed to the front like never before. And it puts us in these challenges of where safety is. Can we really trust this other person to find value in what I have to say? Can we really find this other situation that I'm not familiar with, at least open itself up to me and accept me for what I can contribute? So those are barriers that we have to sort of work our way through. And the point of what I was stating earlier in my presentation is we are adaptable. We are capable of change. We are able to do. And it will take collaborations, as was stated with Trae's presentation. It will take collaborations internally from, you know, the people that we are shoulder to shoulder with, but then stepping out into the community and making those collaborations and appreciating all of those contributions, because in the end result is change. The end result is for the better. And historically, I think I've only been around, I'll just say a segment of the 4,000 or 5,000 years that people have been on this earth. It looks like we adapt over time. We struggle with it. We kick and scream a lot of the places along the way, but we are better off. And I can probably say with somewhat accuracy, probably about another 2,000 years from now, we will still be going forward, kicking and screaming, but we're moving forward.
Thank you, Professor Rolle. Thank you so much. This actually has me leaning into Trae's presentation and the question in the chat. What ways do you suggest contacting organizations in new locations to introduce yourself and your want to collaborate, right? Are we calling? Are we emailing? Do we show up? I don't like calling or email. I show up. What's the available? What's the time? What time you open? You know, what have worked for you and what hasn't?
Sure. I think for me, the first thing is because email seems to be the method of communication these days, I will almost always start with an email. But I think here's maybe where some people go overboard. I'm going to send an email with like 4 sentences. Like, hello, my name is Trae Blanco. I am the blah, blah, blah. I am interested in speaking with you about partnering in an event. This is sort of the idea that I have. Might you have time to discuss? Send. Like, if I get an email from someone that's just like a novel, like just a novel that I'm going to have to read on multiple occasions, I'm probably not going to collaborate with that person. Not because I don't like them, just because I don't know when I'll get to read that email. Now, if we meet in person, or I might respond and say, yeah, could you take a phone call? Right? I'm way into taking phone calls these days. I mean, don't get me wrong, I text a lot as well, but I love to take a call. So I'll try and just speak with people on the phone. And if that seems like we might be able to do something, let's get together. I think depending upon the arts organization, and so many nonprofits sort of operate, maybe they don't operate in traditional workplaces. Like sometimes the executive director of someone's nonprofit is actually running that executive directorship from the basement. Right, so showing up may not be an option because that's like kind of creepy. You're like, hey, I found the address of this place. I'm gonna show up and visit them. And you're driving there in Google Maps and you're in a neighborhood. Okay, stop. Okay, don't go knock on their front door because that's their mailing address, right? That might be too much. So I think just initial, and then that's the sequence. You send the email, give it a week, follow it up with a phone call. If you leave a voicemail and they don't get back to you, see if there's an administrative assistant listed on the website. Call that person, right? And you know, that's kind of my methodology. If unless it's like the most brilliant thing that I've ever thought of known to man, if after 3 strikes I can't get in touch with anyone, it might be time to move on. And I think that also depends upon your time frame of planning. You know, if you're planning an event next month and you haven't heard from someone in a week, they're not your collaborator. I'll tell you that right now. You are gonna have a hard time finding a collaborator for an event next month. But if you're thinking about this as a season approach or months out, I think people are interested in that. And I'll be honest, I've had way surprising encounters with businesses that I thought, well, this is kind of a far-fetched, but who knows, that are just interested in like trying something out, especially if it's not really a huge cost to them, right? You know, you're like, hey, I really love this venue. I'd love to bring this sort of thing to your event. What are your thoughts about that? You know, we've done a couple performances in my first couple years pre-pandemic here inside businesses during our weekend farmers market, and no one goes in those places on farmers market weekend because everyone's in the street. Everyone's visiting the street vendors. So anyone's like, oh yeah, you want a brass quintet to play in our little bookstore, even though it's only like 12 by 12 and that's the loudest thing on earth? Bring them in. Like anything to get people in the doors because everyone just lives in the street during the farmers market. So I think if you're strategic about that, you know, how do you be in touch with people? If you send an email, be brief and direct, and then move on. Oh, and get used to hearing the word no. A lot.
A lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is so good. Is there any other comments before we wrap up? I just put in the chat, thank you so much for engaging with us. Stay connected and return for our next session at 2:30 p.m. I think I got that time right. But any other comments?
We have
from
one more
anyone?
comment.
Oh, great.
So my thoughts are identity influences the individual, and then individual integrate the identity into life. But different person also has different characteristics and tastes, background and race, etc. So my question is, how can art make changes for diverse people with different art tastes to be more opening to other forms of art? And is it necessary to make cross-border among different forms of art to attract the diverse audiences as much as possible? Is it clear?
If I could state, I think diversity wins all the time. Because when perspective becomes broadened, we're at an advantage. So I would say, diversity of art forms, diversity of ideas from art forms, diversity of ideas from different groups, all of that is a win. It's just a win for society. And that's our struggle. As artists, we tend to lean towards more collective thinking, but people outside of that have to come to us to grasp what humanity is really about. It's not about separation. It's about collective. We are better, hey, two heads are better than one. Put it bluntly, but that's my take on this, is that it's all about diversity.
Thank you for your question and thank you for the response, Professor Rolle. Any other comments?
I just want to say quickly how all three of the sessions today connected for me, both physically in my body, but also in my inclusive pedagogy with Professor Erroyl, and then, in contacting how, when you do go into a new space, because we talk about non-traditional places of performance all the time, and it's certain ideals we have and stereotypes of who can perform on the street versus, we see a whole bunch of classical ballet dancers on 125th in Harlem. That's powerful. If those same classical dancers are all white, white presenting women, then what kind of message are we also conveying? So the diversity within every part of the situation, I think is important. The visibility is just the beginning, because that leads to different perspectives, that leads to different communications, different stories. And so, yeah, that's what I gathered from all three of the sessions. They all connected to me. And I just want to thank you so much for such an engaging morning.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.